Chapter 9 Pan-Slavism The Schleswig-Holstein War, March 15, 1852. Bohemia and Croatia, another disjected member of the Slavonic family, acted upon by the Hungarian as Bohemia by the German, were the homes of what is called on the European continent Pan-Slavism. Neither Bohemia nor Croatia was strong enough to exist as a nation by herself. Their respective nationalities, gradually undermined by the action of historical causes that inevitably absorbs into a more energetic stock, could only hope to be restored to anything like independence by an alliance with other Slavonic nations. There were 22 millions of Poles, 45 millions of Russians, 8 millions of Serbians and Bulgarians. Why not form a mighty confederation of the whole 80 millions of Slavonians and drive back or exterminate the intruder upon the holy Slavonic soil, the Turk, the Hungarian, and above all the hated but indispensable Niemitz, the German? Thus, in the studies of a few Slavonian dilettanti of historical science, was this ludicrous, this anti-historical movement, got up a movement which intended nothing less than to subjugate the civilized West under the barbarian East, the town under the country, trade, manufactures, intelligence, under the primitive agriculture of Slavonian serfs. But behind this ludicrous theory stood the terrible reality of the Russian Empire, that empire which by every movement proclaims the pretension of considering all Europe as the domain of the Slavonic race, and especially of the only energetic part of this race, the Russians. That empire which, with two capitals such as St. Petersburg and Moscow, has not yet found its center of gravity, as long as the city of the Tsar, Constantinople, called in Russian Tsarigrad or Tsar's city, considered by every Russian peasant as the true metropolis of his religion and his nation, is not actually the residence of its emperor, that empire which, for the last 150 years, has never lost, but always gained territory by every war it has commenced. And well known in Central Europe are the intrigues by which Russian policy supported the newfangled system of Pan-Slavism, a system than which none better could be invented to suit its purposes. Thus, the Bohemian and Croatian Pan-Slavists, some intentionally, some without knowing it, worked in the direct interests of Russia. They betrayed the revolutionary cause for the shadow of a nationality which, in the best of cases, would have shared the fate of the Polish nationality under Russian sway. It must, however, be said, for the honor of the Poles, that they never got to be seriously entangled in these Pan-Slavist traps, and if few of the aristocracy turned furious Pan-Slavists, they knew that by Russian subjugation they had less to lose than by a revolt of their own peasant serfs. The Bohemians and Croatians called, then, a general Slavonic Congress at Prague for the preparation of the Universal Slavonian Alliance. This Congress would have provided a decided failure even without the interference of the Austrian military. The several Slavonic languages differ quite as much as the English, the German, and the Swedish, and when the proceedings opened, there was no common Slavonic tongue by which the speakers could make themselves understood. French was tried, but was equally unintelligible to the majority, and the poor Slavonic enthusiasts, whose only common feeling was a common hatred against the Germans, were at least obliged to express themselves in the hated German language, as the only one that was generally understood. But just then, another Slavonic Congress was assembling in Prague, in the shape of the Galician Lancers, Croatian and Slovak Grenadiers, and Bohemian Gunners and Cuirassiers. And this real armed Slavonic Congress, under the command of Windischgratz, in less than 24 hours, drove the founders of an imaginary Slavonian supremacy out of the town and dispersed them into the winds. The Bohemian, Moravian, Dalmatian, and part of the Polish deputies, the aristocracy, to the Austrian constituent diet, made in that assembly a systematic war upon the German element. The Germans and part of the Poles, the impoverished nobility, were in this assembly the chief supporters of revolutionary progress. The mass of Slavonic deputies, in opposing them, were not satisfied with thus showing clearly the reactionary tendencies of the entire movement, but they were degraded enough to tamper and conspire with the very same Austrian government which had dispersed their meeting at Prague. They, too, were paid for this infamous conduct. After supporting the government during the insurrection of October 1848, an event which finally secured to them a majority of the Diet, this now almost exclusively Slavonic Diet was dispersed by Austrian soldiers, the same time as the Prague Congress, and the Pan-Slavists threatened with imprisonment if they should stir again. And they have only obtained this, that Slavonic nationality is now being everywhere undermined by Austrian centralization, a result for which they may thank their own fanaticism and blindness. If the frontiers of Hungary and Germany had admitted of any doubt, there would certainly have been another quarrel there, but fortunately there was no pretext, and the interests of both nations being intimately related, they struggled against the same enemies, the Austrian government and the Pan-Slavic fanaticism. The good understanding was not for a moment disturbed, but the Italian Revolution entangled at least a part of Germany in an internecine war, and it must be stated here, as proof how far the Metternichian system had succeeded in keeping back the development of the public mind, that during the first 6 months of 1848, the same men that had in Vienna mounted the barricades went full of enthusiasm to join the army that fought against the Italian patriots. This deplorable confusion of ideas did not, however, last long. Lastly, there was the war with Denmark about Schleswig and Holstein. These countries, unquestionably German by nationality, language, and predilection, are also from military, naval, and commercial grounds necessary to Germany. Their inhabitants have, for the last 3 years, struggled hard against Danish intrusion. The right of treaties, besides, was for them. The Revolution of March brought them into open collision with the Danes, and Germany supported them. But while in Poland, in Italy, in Bohemia, and later on in Hungary, military operations were pushed with the utmost vigor, in this the only at least partially, revolutionary war, a system of resultless marches and counter-marches was adopted, and an interference of foreign diplomacy was submitted to, which led, after many an heroic engagement, to a most miserable end. The German government betrayed during the war the Schleswig-Holstein Revolutionary Army in every occasion, and allowed it purposely to be cut up when dispersed or divided by the Danes. The German corps of volunteers were treated the same. But while thus the German name earned nothing but hatred on every side, the German constitutional and liberal governments rubbed their hands for joy. They had succeeded in crushing the Polish and the Bohemian movements. They had everywhere revived the old national animosities, which heretofore had prevented any common understanding and action between the German, the Pole, the Italian. They had accustomed the people to scenes of civil war and repression by the military. The Prussian army had regained its confidence in Poland, the Austrian army in Prague. And while the superabundant patriotism, die patriotische Überkraft, as Heine has it, of revolutionary but short-sighted youth was led in Schleswig and Lombardy to be crushed by the grape shot of the enemy, the regular army, the real instrument of action, both of Prussia and Austria, was placed in a position to regain public favor by victories over the foreigner. But we repeat, these armies, strengthened by the liberals as a means of action against the more advanced party, no sooner had recovered their self-confidence and their discipline in some degree than they had turned themselves against the liberals and restored to power the men of the old system. When Radetzky, in his camp beyond the Adige, received the first orders from the responsible ministers, quote-unquote, at Vienna, he exclaimed, "Who are these ministers? They are not the government of Austria. Austria is now nowhere but in my camp.
I and my army?
We are Austria, and when we shall have beaten the Italians, we shall reconquer the empire for the emperor." End quote. And old Radetzky was right, but the imbecile, quote, "responsible," unquote, ministers at Vienna heeded him not.